Hello everyone. I am the boring historian and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The stone walls of the castle kept whispering their secrets as I pressed my palm against the cold surface. 1,000 years of women's lives, their joys and sorrows, their triumphs and struggles, all absorbed into these silent stones. What tales would they tell if they could speak? This account aims to resurrect those voices, to breathe life into the experiences of women who lived during the 1,000 years we now call the Middle Ages. Their stories are not one story but many, varying dramatically by region, social class, time period, and individual circumstance. From peasant to queen, from nun to merchant's wife, from midwife to accused witch, these women navigated a world that often rendered them invisible in official histories, yet depended upon their labor, wisdom, and resilience. Through historical evidence, contemporary accounts, and imagined first-person narratives based on documented experiences, we will journey across medieval Europe from the fall of Rome to the dawn of the Renaissance. We will witness how women carved out spaces of autonomy and meaning within the constraints of patriarchal structures, how they survived war and plague, how they loved and lost, worked and prayed, learned and taught. This is not merely an academic exercise, but an attempt to reconnect with our foremothers, to understand their world on their terms, and to recognize both the vast differences and surprising similarities between their lives and our own. I still remember my grandmother's stories of Rome, of marble palaces and flowing water, of theaters and libraries. Now I live in a world of wood and mud, where even the nobles fight over scraps of the old glory. Yet in some ways, with the old structures falling, we women have found new spaces to exert our influence. Fictional account based on women's experiences in 6th century Gaul. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE marked the beginning of profound transformations across Europe. As Roman administrative structures crumbled, new powers emerged. Germanic kingdoms in the west, the Byzantine Empire in the east, and eventually the rise of Islam to the south. For women, these political shifts brought both challenges and unexpected opportunities. In many Germanic societies, women held positions of surprising authority. Archaeological evidence from graves shows that women could be wealthy property owners, with some female burials containing riches and symbols of status. The Germanic law codes, written down as these tribes established kingdoms, reveal complex attitudes toward women. The Visigothic code allowed women to inherit property and represent themselves in court. Under Lombard law, women remained under male guardianship, mundium, but could own and manage property. Among the Franks, the Wergild, blood price for killing a woman of childbearing age, was higher than for a man of equivalent status, a reflection of women's valued reproductive capacity. Theodelinda, Queen of the Lombards, 572-628 CE, exemplifies the political influence some women could wield. As a widow, she chose her second husband herself and made him king. She then negotiated the conversion of the Lombards from Arianism to Catholicism, corresponding directly with Pope Gregory the Great. For most women in the early medieval period, daily life centered on ensuring survival in increasingly localized economies. The villa system of late Rome gave way to smaller settlements where subsistence agriculture was the primary concern. First-person narrative. A Frankish peasant woman, circa 550 CE. The rooster crows and I rise before the others, stirring the embers in our hearth to life. My back aches from yesterday's work in the fields, but the barley must be harvested before the rains come. My husband and sons will do the cutting, but my daughters and I will bind the sheaves and carry them. After that, There is bread to bake, cloth to weave, and children to mind. Last winter was harsh. We lost our youngest to fever, and I still feel her absence like a hole in my heart. But life continues its relentless pace. The Lord demands his portion of our harvest, the priest demands our attendance at Mass, and the seasons demand our labor. My mother taught me which herbs heal fevers and which ease births. The village women come to me now as they once went to her. The priest frowns at such women's knowledge, but when his own fever struck last winter, he did not refuse my willow bark tea. They say the world is changing, that the old empire is no more. But here, among our fields and forests, life follows the same rhythms it always has. We women tend the flame of life through birth and death, hunger and plenty, war and peace. Agricultural work was not strictly divided by gender. Women worked in the fields alongside men during crucial harvest times. However, women were primarily responsible for domestic production, food preparation, textile creation, child rearing, and care for the elderly and sick. This women's work was essential to survival but often undervalued in historical accounts. The spread of Christianity throughout Europe profoundly affected women's lives and opportunities. While the Christian Church reinforced patriarchal structures, it also provided new avenues for female education, authority, and autonomy through religious life. The double monastery at Whitby, led by Abbess Hilda in 7th century Anglo-Saxon England, demonstrates the significant spiritual and intellectual leadership women could exercise. Hilda, 614–680 CE, advised kings and bishops, oversaw the education of 5 future bishops, and hosted the Synod of Whitby in 6664 CE, which determined the future direction of the English Church. First-person narrative, a novice at Whitby Abbey, circa 670 CE. The stone is cold beneath my knees as I pray before dawn, but my heart burns with purpose. 3 years ago, I arrived at Whitby's gates, a widowed noblewoman with no desire to remarry. Now I find myself transformed, my days filled with prayer, study, and service. Our Abbess Hilda moves through our community like a living flame, stern yet kind, brilliant yet humble. Yesterday she corrected my Latin translation of Psalm 23, then sat with me to explain the finer points of grammar. Kings seek her counsel, yet she finds time to ensure each of us grows in wisdom. In the scriptorium, I am learning to copy manuscripts, to form each letter with precision and care. Brother Aidan says I have a gift for illumination. My fingers are permanently stained with ink, but I feel a pride in this work that I never knew in my husband's household. Here, among women, I have found a different kind of family. We argue, we laugh, we pray together. Some, like Sister Ethelthryth, came to escape unwanted marriages. Others, like young Bertha, were sent as oblates, dedicated to God by their families. Each has her own story, her own relationship with God. Outside these walls, women are valued for their bloodlines and fertility. Inside, we are valued for our minds, our devotions, our skills. I know now why Mother fought so hard against my coming here, and why I fought even harder to stay. Female monasticism offered an alternative to marriage for women from noble families and a path to education otherwise largely unavailable to women. Nuns could learn to read and write in Latin, study religious texts, produce manuscripts, and manage extensive properties. While always under male ecclesiastical authority, abbesses could wield considerable power, managing large estates and communities. While Western Europe experienced fragmentation and rural simplification, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, maintained urban civilization and Roman legal traditions, though increasingly influenced by Christianity. The Byzantine Empress Theodora, 497–548 CE, wife of Justinian I, exemplifies the potential heights of female power. Rising from humble origins as an actress, a profession associated with prostitution, she became Justinian's most trusted advisor. During the Nika riots of 532 CE, when Justinian considered fleeing, Theodora famously declared, "Royal purple is the noblest shroud," convincing him to stay and suppress the uprising. Her influence on Byzantine law improved women's rights regarding divorce, property ownership, and protection from sexual violence. For ordinary Byzantine women, life was constrained by both Roman traditions and Christian morality. Urban women could work as silk weavers, midwives, or in family businesses. The importance of female virginity and modesty increased over time, with women increasingly secluded in separate quarters of the household. Dine Canitas. The rise of Islam in the 7th century and the subsequent Muslim conquest of Spain, Sicily, and parts of southern Italy brought European women into contact with different gender norms and legal traditions. In Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, 3 religious communities, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, coexisted. Each maintained their own legal systems regarding women's status and rights. Muslim women in Al-Andalus could inherit and manage property, initiate divorce under certain conditions, and pursue education, rights not always available to their Christian counterparts in Northern Europe. First-person narrative. A merchant's daughter in Córdoba, circa 950 CE. The courtyard of our home feels cool, despite the summer heat. The fountain's gentle splash mingles with the sound of my younger sisters reciting their lessons with our tutor. I completed those same lessons years ago, Arabic grammar, poetry, calculation, before focusing on managing my father's household accounts. From my window, I can see Christians passing by on their way to church, the women's heads covered much like our own. We rarely speak with them, though sometimes their merchants come to trade with my father. The Jewish quarter lies beyond the next street. Their women are known for their skill in medicine. Tomorrow, I will visit the public bath with my mother and aunt. It is our weekly opportunity to socialize with other women, to share news and arrange marriages. My own marriage contract was finalized last month to the son of my father's business partner. My father consulted me before agreeing, and the terms protect my inheritance and specify that I may continue to manage my own property. I have packed several books to take to my new home, collections of poetry and mathematics that were gifts from my grandfather. My betrothed has promised me a room for my studies. Not all women in Córdoba are so fortunate in their education or their marriages, but as a merchant's daughter of good family, I have privileges many do not. This narrative reflects historical realities of educated Muslim women in urban Al-Andalus, though individual experiences varied widely by class, family attitudes, and personal circumstance. The crowning of Charlemagne as Holy Roman Emperor in 800 CE marked the emergence of a new political order in Western Europe. The Carolingian dynasty attempted to revive learning and establish administrative consistency across their vast territories. Charlemagne's mother, Bertrada of Leon, and his daughters influenced his court culture. His daughter Bertha ran his household, while other daughters were educated alongside sons in the palace school. However, Charlemagne refused to allow his daughters to marry, keeping them at court, perhaps to prevent the emergence of competing dynastic claims through their children. The Carolingian Renaissance increased the production of manuscripts and the standardization of religious practices. For literate noble women, this meant greater access to religious texts and participation in intellectual culture. For common women, the increasing power of the institutional church meant greater regulation of marriage, sexuality, and religious practice. The Viking Age, approximately 793 to 1066 CE, saw Scandinavian expansion across Europe through trade, raid, and settlement. Archaeological and textual evidence reveals that Norse women maintained significant authority within households and communities. In rural Scandinavia and Viking settlements, women managed farms during men's long absences on trading or raiding expeditions. They controlled the distribution of food stores, textile production, and dairy processing, all essential to survival in the harsh northern climate. Norse women could own property, initiate divorce, and even occasionally participate in trade. Grave goods from female burials include keys, symbols of household authority, trade goods, and sometimes weapons. The legal position of women in Norse society was relatively strong compared to many contemporary European cultures. First-person narrative, a Norse woman in a settlement in Iceland, circa 90 AD CE. The wind howls outside our longhouse, bringing the first snow of winter. I check our stores once more. The dried fish, the preserved meat, the barrels of fermented milk. Will it be enough to see us through until spring? My husband Bjorn has been gone since summer on a trading voyage to Dublin. Whether he returns with riches or not at all, the survival of our household rests on my management. My daughter Freydis helps me at the loom, her fingers already more skilled than mine at 14. My sons are out checking the livestock. We've brought the most valuable animals into the byres attached to our house, but the sheep must weather the storms in the rough shelters on the hillside. Yesterday at the Thing Assembly, I spoke for our household in a dispute over grazing rights. Some of the men grumbled to see a woman speak, but our laws are clear. In my husband's absence, I hold his authority. I won our case, securing the northern pasture for our use next summer. Before we left Norway, I was known for my skill in herb lore and prophecy. Here in our new settlement, women still come to me for healing and to hear the wisdom of the Sather, Norse shamanic practice. The Christian priest who arrived last year disapproves, but even he sought my remedies when fever struck his household. The fire throws shadows on the wall, reminding me of the old stories of Freya and Frigg, goddesses of love and hearth. Some of our people have abandoned these gods for the White Christ, but I still place offerings at our household shrine. The gods of our ancestors have sustained us through famine and storm, birth and death. I will not turn from them now. This narrative reflects archaeological and textual evidence about Norse women's domestic authority, religious roles, and legal standing, though individual experiences varied by status, wealth, and location. By the year 1000, feudalism had emerged as the dominant social structure across much of Western Europe. This hierarchical system, based on the exchange of land for military service, was fundamentally gendered, designed around male warriors and inheritance through the male line. For noble women, the feudal system meant their primary value lay in forming marriage alliances and producing male heirs. Yet many found ways to exercise power within these constraints. When lords departed for war, crusade, or court, their wives typically assumed management of estates. These castellanas, castle ladies, collected rents, dispensed justice, defended property, and supervised agricultural production. Eleanor of Aquitaine, 1122–1204, exemplifies the potential heights of female feudal power. As Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, queen consort to both France and later England, and mother of kings, Eleanor wielded extraordinary influence. During her son Richard Furfur's absence on crusade, she served as regent of England despite being in her 70s. First-person narrative, a Norman noblewoman, circa 1180 CE. The steward presents the accounts as I sit in my husband's chair in the Great Hall. 4 months he has been gone now, fighting alongside King Henry in Normandy. 4 months I have ruled Blackmere Castle and its surrounding villages in his stead. The mill's repair is complete, my lady, the steward reports. and the new tax has been collected from all but the village of Thornton, where poor harvests have left them short. I consider this. Reduce Thornton's obligation by 1/3 this season. We will recover it next year. Hungry peasants make poor workers and poorer soldiers when my lord returns to call them to service. The steward looks disapproving, but notes my decision. When my father arranged my marriage at 13, I knew nothing of estate management. Now at 26, I oversee 5 manors, dispense justice to our tenants, and negotiate with neighboring lords who sometimes mistake my husband's absence for weakness. After the accounts come the disputes. 2 peasants arguing over a boundary stone, a miller accused of taking excessive portion of the grain he grinds, a request for permission to marry. For each, I must balance justice, mercy, and the interests of our estate. Later, I will check the stores, inspect the new tapestry being woven for the chapel, review my children's progress with their tutor, and write to my husband with news of his lands. My mother-in-law claims I take too much upon myself, that a lady should concern herself only with household matters and leave governance to men. But my husband values my management, which has increased his wealth and maintained peace in his absence. Tonight, I will pray for his safe return, not only from love, but from weariness. The burden of dual roles, both lord and lady of the manor, grows heavy. Yet I cannot deny the satisfaction of seeing my decisions bear fruit, of knowing these lands prosper under my care. For medieval noblewomen, marriage was a political and economic transaction arranged to benefit family interests. Girls could be betrothed as young as 7 and married at 12, though consummation was sometimes delayed until they were physically mature. A noblewoman's primary duty was producing legitimate heirs. Childbirth represented both her greatest power and greatest danger. Maternal mortality rates were extremely high. A 12th century noblewoman might experience 10 or more pregnancies during her lifetime. Christine de Pizan, writing in the early 15th century, recalled her mother's resistance to using wet nurses, insisting on breastfeeding her children herself, despite this being uncommon among noblewomen. This illustrates the personal choices some women could make, even within rigid social expectations. Beyond biological motherhood, noblewomen were responsible for educating young children of both sexes, as well as supervising the education of noble girls sent to their households for training. They taught practical skills, social behavior, religious observance, and sometimes literacy. The High Middle Ages saw the proliferation of new religious orders and the reform of existing ones. For women, religious life continued to offer alternatives to marriage and opportunities for education and administrative responsibility. However, female religious communities faced increasing restrictions. The Fourth Lateran Council, 1215, mandated strict enclosure for nuns, limiting their interactions with the outside world. Despite these constraints, women founded innovative religious movements. Hildegard of Bingen, 1098 to 1179, a German Benedictine abbess, composed music, wrote theological, botanical, and medicinal texts, and reported mystical visions. Her correspondence with popes, emperors, and other powerful figures demonstrates the authority a woman could achieve through religious life. The Beguines, lay religious women who took temporary vows and lived in semi-autonomous communities, emerged in the Low Countries. Neither nuns nor laywomen, they created a new space for female spiritual expression and economic independence through collective living and textile production. First-person narrative. A Cistercian nun, circa 1250 CE. The hour of prime calls us to prayer as the first light touches the abbey windows. My voice joins 40 others in the chant that structures our days. the same words, the same melodies, linking us to thousands of other religious women across Christendom. I came to this place 20 years ago, a 14-year-old widow with a small dowry and no desire to return to my father's control or enter another marriage. The Abbey has become more home to me than my childhood manor ever was. After Mass, I return to the scriptorium where I am completing an illuminated psalter. My specialty is the intricate vine work that borders each page, though Sister Agnes creates the more complex illustrations. Our abbess encourages our work, both for the glory of God and for the income it brings our community through commissions. Not all sisters find fulfillment here. Young Agnes was sent against her will when her father remarried and her stepmother wanted her gone. She still cries at night sometimes. Others came as elderly widows seeking a dignified retirement and prayers for their souls. Each brings her own story, her own relationship with our enclosed world. The restrictions grow tighter each year. Bishop Hugh has ordered that our parlor window, where we once could speak freely with visitors, be covered with a black curtain so we cannot be seen. Our confessors warn against the sin of curiosity about the outside world. Yet news still reaches us of the university scholars in Paris, of the crusades in distant lands, of the magnificent cathedral rising in Cologne. We live in the world while set apart from it. In our prayers, we hold all of humanity. In our daily work, the copying of manuscripts, the tending of the sick, the education of novices, we serve both God and our fellow creatures. There is purpose in this life, and a quiet power that many outside our walls might envy. This narrative reflects historical evidence about female monastic life, including the intellectual work of manuscript production, the diversity of women who entered convents, and the increasing restrictions on female religious communities during this period. The High Middle Ages saw significant urban growth and commercial development. Towns offered different opportunities and constraints for women than rural manorial systems. The brewing industry provides an interesting case study of gender shifts in medieval labor. Initially dominated by alewives, women who brewed and sold ale from their homes, by the late medieval period brewing became increasingly commercialized, regulated by guilds, and male-dominated. First-person narrative. A silk worker in Lucca, Italy, circa 1270 CE. My fingers move deftly across the fine threads, weaving patterns I can almost feel in my sleep. 25 years I have worked with silk, first as a girl helping my mother, then as a wife working alongside my husband, and now as a widow continuing our workshop with my daughters and 2 apprentices. The guild masters watch us closely. As a widow, I am permitted to maintain my husband's workshop, but I cannot take on new apprentices beyond those he trained. My oldest daughter will soon marry a merchant who trades our silks in France, a good match that will secure our business connections, though I will miss her skilled hands at the loom. Yesterday a new order came from the cathedral, gold-threaded silk for vestments. Such commissions keep us fed through winter. The silk itself comes from far away, Constantinople, Sicily, even distant Cathay. When it arrives rough and raw, it's hard to imagine it becoming the luminous fabric that adorns nobles and churchmen. The work is hard on the eyes. Katerina, my youngest, already squints in the fading afternoon light. I should send her to the market instead. At 12, she needs to learn all aspects of our trade. But her weaving shows such promise. My neighbor Sophia began as a silk worker like myself, but now runs a lending business from her home. The priests condemn usury, but widows must be practical to survive. Sometimes I lend small amounts to other craftswomen when orders are slow. We women keep each other afloat in a world where the guilds and town councils remain firmly in men's hands. Tonight, the Silk Workers' Confraternity meets to pray for our patron saint, and contribute to our mutual aid fund. Though not officially recognized like the Men's Guild, our association ensures that none of our members' children go hungry when work is scarce or hands are injured. In this, at least, we women have created our own system when the official one excludes us. This narrative reflects historical evidence about women's work in the textile industry, the status of widows in craft production, and the informal networks women created when excluded from formal guild structures. Merchants' wives in medieval towns often acted as business partners, keeping accounts, managing household workshops, and sometimes trading in their husband's absence. Unlike rural women, urban women lived in closer proximity to markets, churches, and neighbors, creating different patterns of daily life. The House Book of Ménager de Paris, written around 1393 by a wealthy Parisian husband for his young wife, offers insights into urban household management. It includes instructions on running servants, preparing food, maintaining gardens, and managing finances, all considered part of a merchant's wife's duties. Throughout the Middle Ages, women served as midwives and healers, drawing on practical experience and traditional knowledge passed from mother to daughter. In southern Europe, particularly Italy and Spain, some women achieved formal medical training and recognition. Trotula of Salerno, 11th to 12th century, is associated with several influential treatises on women's medicine. Whether Trotula was a single historical figure or a composite, the texts attributed to her remain standard medical references for centuries. As universities formalized medical education in the 12th and 13th centuries, women were increasingly excluded from official practice. However, they continued to provide essential health care, particularly in obstetrics, gynecology, and general family care. First-person narrative, a midwife in York, England, circa 1290 CE. The messenger comes before dawn. Martin the carpenter's wife has begun her labor with their first child. I gather my birthing stool, clean linens, oils, and herbs, saying a quick prayer to Saint Margaret, protector of women in childbirth. At the carpenter's modest home, I find the mother-to-be pacing anxiously, her own mother and sister already attending her. The room has been prepared as I instructed. Clean straw on the floor, a fire burning despite the summer warmth, windows covered to create a warm, dark space resembling the womb. How long between pains? I ask, washing my hands with vinegar as the women report her progress. I examine her, feeling the position of the child. The baby is well placed, I assure her. Your body knows what to do. For hours, we work together, the laboring woman, her female relatives, and myself. I offer raspberry leaf tea to strengthen her contractions, massage her back with warm oil, guide her through different positions to ease the baby's passage. I tell stories of successful births, sing old songs that mark the rhythm of labor, and whisper encouragements. When transition comes, with its intensity and fear, I hold her eyes with mine. Every woman before you has felt this fear. You are not alone. The pain brings your child closer. I have attended over 200 births, yet each woman needs to hear that her experience is both universal and uniquely her own. When the child finally slides into my waiting hands, a boy, red-faced and howling, I place him immediately on his mother's chest. The women weep and laugh with relief and joy. I deliver the afterbirth, check it carefully for completeness, then examine the mother for tears or excessive bleeding. The town physician would have charged this family more than they earn in 3 months. He would have bled the mother to balance her humors and likely harmed more than helped. We midwives know that birth is not an illness, but a natural process that sometimes needs gentle guidance. Before leaving, I prepare a tincture for healing and show the grandmother how to bind the mother's belly with clean cloths. I will return tomorrow to check their progress. For now, I leave them to the private miracle of becoming a family, while I return home to my own children. Thankful that today brought life rather than death, a blessing never taken for granted in our uncertain world. This narrative reflects historical evidence about medieval midwifery practices, including the use of herbs, massage, positional changes, and community support during childbirth. It also acknowledges the tensions between traditional female healers and university-trained male physicians. While urban centers grew during the High Middle Ages, the vast majority of European women continued to live in rural communities, working the land and maintaining households. For peasant women, daily life followed seasonal rhythms of planting, tending, harvesting, and preserving. Women's agricultural work typically included gardening and tending small livestock, chickens, pigs, dairy production, milking, making butter and cheese, harvesting alongside men during crucial seasons, processing crops, threshing, winnowing, preserving food for winter months. Beyond agricultural labor, rural women produced textiles, spinning, weaving, and sewing clothing for their families. This domestic production was essential to survival and could also generate income through sale of surplus cloth. First-person narrative: a peasant woman in northern France circa 1220 CE. My day begins and ends with fire, kindling it at dawn, banking it at night. Between, there is always work. Feeding the chickens and pigs, milking our cow, kneading dough for the communal oven, weeding our garden strips, spinning wool as I walk to check our sheep in the common pasture. Today, we begin the barley harvest. My husband and sons will cut with scythes, while my daughters and I follow, binding sheaves. The sun will bake our backs, but a poor harvest means hunger in winter, so we work from dawn until dusk, stopping only when light fails us. The Lord's steward watches from horseback, ensuring his master receives his portion. After the harvest, I must also work 3 days in the Lord's fields, labor required beyond the portion of our crops we surrender. My oldest son works 2 days each week on the Lord's land year-round. We call it robot, the forced labor that marks us as unfree. Yet we are luckier than many. The new clearing gives us more land than my parents farmed. The mill, though it takes its share of our grain, saves me hours of grinding by hand. And our priest, though stern, allows us our traditional celebrations at harvest's end, when we crown a harvest queen and dance away our exhaustion. Winter will bring different work, spinning and weaving by firelight, repairing tools, smoking meat, preserving vegetables in brine. Women's work never ends, merely changes with the seasons. My grandmother taught me that our work is a prayer, each loaf of bread, each length of cloth, each preserved fruit an offering to God and family. The church bell rings sext midday prayers. We pause briefly, crossing ourselves before returning to our labor. Heaven may wait, but the harvest will not. This narrative reflects historical evidence about peasant women's diverse responsibilities, the obligations of the manorial system, the communal aspects of medieval village life, and the integration of religious observance into daily activities. For medieval peasants, marriage was less about political alliance than economic partnership. Young people had more say in choosing spouses than their noble counterparts, though parental approval remained important. Rural women typically married in their late teens or early 20s, later than noble women. This pattern reflected the need to accumulate resources before establishing a household. Peasant marriages required less formal negotiation than noble ones, though property considerations remained important. Village communities enforced social norms through collective action. Women participated in communal governance through informal networks and sometimes through public shaming rituals directed at those who violated community standards. The High Middle Ages saw significant agricultural innovations. the heavy plow, three-field rotation, improved harnesses, and watermills. These technologies increased productivity, but had complex effects on gender divisions of labor. As grain production intensified, requiring upper body strength to manage heavy plows, men's agricultural roles gained prominence. However, women's labor remained essential to household survival, particularly in food processing, textile production, and care work. The 12th century saw the emergence of courtly love literature, which presented a complex and contradictory image of noblewomen. Troubadours praised ladies as objects of devotion and sources of inspiration. Yet this adoration existed alongside legal and social structures that limited women's autonomy. Marie de France, writing in the late 12th century, produced lace, narrative poems that explored love, desire, and power from perspectives that sometimes challenged conventional gender expectations. Her work demonstrates that women contributed to medieval literary culture, not only as inspiration, but as creators. The Roman de la Rose, begun by Guillaume de Loris around 1230 and completed by Jean de Meun around 1275, presents conflicting images of women, as idealized beloveds and as deceitful temptresses. This duality reflects medieval Christianity's ambivalent attitudes toward women, simultaneously venerating the Virgin Mary while blaming Eve for humanity's fall. First-person narrative. A lady at the court of Champagne, circa 1170 CE. The troubadour's voice rises to the vaulted ceiling, singing praise of an unnamed lady whose beauty outshines the sun. The courtiers sigh appreciatively, glancing at me to gauge my reaction. As the Countess's chief lady-in-waiting, I am versed in the proper response. A gentle smile, perhaps a slight blush, never direct acknowledgement. Countess Marie nods approvingly beside me. Under her patronage, our court has become renowned for its refinement, its games of love and poetry. She herself adjudicates the courts of love, playful tribunals where questions of romantic conduct are debated with the seriousness of legal proceedings. Last week's question: can true love exist between married people? The Countess ruled it cannot. Marriage is obligation, while love must be freely given. Her own marriage to Count Henry was arranged for political advantage when she was 11. Now they maintain separate households, meeting primarily for official functions. After the performance, we ladies retire to the Countess's private chambers for reading. She has commissioned a translation of Ovid's works and takes pleasure in our discussions of love's philosophy. I was fortunate. My father valued learning and provided me education before sending me to court at 14. Many ladies here can barely read the devotional texts in their prayer books. Tomorrow, a new knight arrives, recently returned from Outremer, the Crusader states. The court will buzz with speculation about his adventures, his wealth, his availability for marriage or dalliance. We ladies will be displayed like fine tapestries, ornamental and valuable, but ultimately possessions to be admired and acquired. Yet within these constraints, we find spaces for agency. The Countess wields significant political influence through her correspondence and patronage. Several ladies here manage extensive properties while their husbands pursue war or court politics. And even in arranged marriages, many find ways to negotiate respect, if not love. The troubadour's song praises a woman's beauty but never her mind. In private, we laugh at such simplicity. Our power may be veiled, but it is real, exercised through influence rather than command, through networks of loyalty and obligation that run beneath the visible structures of feudal authority. This narrative reflects historical evidence about aristocratic women's court life, the literary culture of courtly love, and the contrast between public performance of gender roles and private exercise of influence. Jewish communities maintained distinct legal and cultural traditions throughout medieval Europe, though their status and treatment varied dramatically by region and period. Under Jewish law, halakha, women had certain protections and obligations different from those of Christian women. Marriage contracts, ketubot, required financial provision for wives, including in case of divorce. Jewish women could own property and engage in business, particularly as moneylenders when Jews were restricted from other occupations. Domestic religious observance, particularly maintaining dietary laws, kashrut, fell primarily to women. This gave them significant religious responsibility within the household, though formal religious leadership remained male. Education among Jewish women varied by region and family custom. In Ashkenazi communities, Northern Europe, some women received vernacular religious education and occasionally Hebrew literacy. In Sephardic communities, Spain, Portugal, southern France, elite women sometimes attained higher levels of secular and religious learning. First-person narrative. A Jewish woman in Worms, Germany, circa 1160 CE. The marketplace buzzes with activity as I make my way through with my daughter Rebecca. Christians glance at us, some with indifference, others with poorly disguised contempt. The yellow badge on my cloak marks me as a Jew, as if my separate neighborhood and distinctive headdress were not enough. We stop at a stall to examine spices. I need saffron for Sabbath bread, but hesitate at the price. The merchant knows I am preparing for our holy day and raises his price accordingly. Such is life outside the Jewish quarter, a constant negotiation, a careful balance between necessity and dignity. My husband Isaac is a silver merchant, relatively prosperous by our community's standards. When Christian guilds restricted Jews from most crafts, he turned to trade and money lending. I keep his accounts and sometimes conduct business in his absence. Our marriage contract, my ketubah, protects my property and ensures I would be provided for if widowed or divorced. At home, my mother-in-law supervises the Sabbath preparations. Our kitchen maintains strict separation between milk and meat, with different utensils for each, as our law requires. This responsibility falls to women, to maintain the ritual purity of the household, to teach children our traditions, to create the peaceful space of Shabbat amid a world often hostile to our existence. Last Passover, a Christian child went missing, and rumors of ritual murder spread through the town. Though the child was later found drowned, the damage was done. A Jewish family at the edge of our quarter was attacked, their home burned. The bishop's protection and our community's payment of special taxes did not prevent the violence. Yet we endure. Tonight I will light the Sabbath candles as Jewish women have done for generations. My sons study Torah with their father and the community scholars. My daughters learn the women's prayers and songs, the recipes and customs that preserve our identity. Between Sunset Friday and Sunset Saturday, we create a world apart, a taste of the perfected world to come, where peace reigns and persecution is no more. This narrative reflects historical evidence about medieval Jewish women's experiences, including their economic roles, domestic religious responsibilities, and navigation of Christian-dominated societies that often imposed discriminatory restrictions and erupted in violence against Jewish communities. The bubonic plague that struck Europe in 1347-1351 killed approximately one-third of the population. This demographic catastrophe transformed European society, with significant implications for women's lives and opportunities. The immediate aftermath of the Black Death created acute labor shortages. For surviving women, this sometimes translated into economic opportunities. Higher wages for female servants and agricultural workers, expansion of women's participation in previously male-dominated crafts, increased mobility as women migrated to towns seeking better conditions, more favorable marriage prospects as women became demographically scarce. However, these opportunities proved temporary in many regions. By the early 15th century, legislation like England's Statute of Labourers attempted to cap wages and restrict worker mobility, while guilds increasingly excluded women to protect male economic privileges. First-person narrative: a widow in post-plague London, circa 1360 CE. The churchyard behind St. Paul's bulges with fresh graves. 3 years since the great mortality struck, yet sometimes I still wake believing I'll find my husband Thomas and our 2 sons at breakfast. Instead, I rise alone to open our workshop, now my workshop. Before the pestilence, I worked alongside Thomas, dyeing wool cloth the rich blue that made our shop known throughout Cheapside. Few women were permitted full membership in the Dyers Guild, but as his widow, I continue under his guild rights. The alternative, remarriage to another guild member who would absorb our business, holds little appeal. At 40, I prefer my independence, hard-won though it may be. Apprentices are scarce since the plague. Young Will, who survived while my sons did not, now demands twice the wage Thomas would have paid. Yet I cannot manage without him, so I pay and count myself fortunate. The Flemish woman I hired last month brings new techniques for fixing colors that will give our cloth advantage in the market. The guild masters grumble about women like me holding positions meant for men. Last month, they proposed a statute limiting widows' guild privileges to 1 year after a husband's death. I joined 5 other widows to petition the mayor against it, bringing samples of our work and records of our tax payments to demonstrate our value to the city. For now, the proposal has been set aside. Tonight, I'll attend my parish guild's meeting. Since the plague, our women's section has taken on greater responsibilities, managing larger charitable donations and arranging more elaborate commemorations for the dead. So many dead to remember, yet life continues its stubborn course. Sometimes I wonder what Thomas would make of my transformation. The quiet wife who deferred to his business decisions now negotiates contracts with merchants from as far as Florence. Necessity teaches skills one never thought to learn. Grief hardens into resolve, and London, though diminished, adapts to its altered circumstances, as do we all. This narrative reflects historical evidence about some women's expanded economic roles following the Black Death, as well as the institutional resistance that eventually curtailed many of these opportunities. Marjorie Kempe, c. 1373 to 1438, whose autobiography provides rare insights into a medieval woman's life, exemplifies post-plague complexity. After bearing 14 children, she negotiated a chaste marriage with her husband to pursue religious devotion, undertook pilgrimages across Europe, and dictated her life story despite being illiterate herself. The late 14th century saw major peasant uprisings across Europe: the Jacquerie in France, 1358, the English Peasants' Revolt, 1381, and the Ciompi Revolt in Florence, 1378. These movements protested increased taxation, labor restrictions, and attempts to reimpose pre-plague social hierarchies. Women participated actively in these revolts. During the English Peasants' Revolt, women attacked tax collectors, destroyed tax records, and marched alongside men to London. Court records documenting punishment of rebels include numerous women. This female participation reflects women's economic stakes in these conflicts and their integration into community resistance networks. While medieval political theory excluded women from formal authority, practice sometimes diverged from theory, particularly in moments of crisis. The 14th and 15th centuries saw significant evolution in women's religious experiences. Female mystics claimed direct communication with God, bypassing male ecclesiastical hierarchies. Their visions, revelations, and extreme ascetic practices created space for female spiritual authority. Catherine of Siena, 1347 to 1380, exemplifies this phenomenon. Despite being a woman with no formal education, she became politically influential through her reputation for holiness, successfully advocating for the Pope's return to Rome from Avignon. Julian of Norwich, 1343 to c. 1416, wrote the first known book in English by a woman, Revelations of Divine Love, based on visions she received during a serious illness. Her theology emphasized God's maternal aspects and universal salvation, relatively radical concepts for her time. First-person narrative. A Beguine in Ghent, Flanders, circa 1380 CE. The soft rhythm of shared prayer fills our beguinage as evening falls. 20 women's voices rise together, some young and clear, others cracked with age. Unlike nuns, we have taken no permanent vows, maintain our own property, and may leave to marry if we choose. Few do. This community of women, neither fully religious nor fully secular, offers freedoms rare elsewhere. I came here 15 years ago after my betrothed died of the plague. My merchant father, seeing no advantage in arranging another marriage for his aging daughter, provided a modest endowment that supports my life here. Some of our sisters come from poorer backgrounds, supporting themselves through our collective weaving enterprise and caring for the sick in our infirmary. Our spiritual director, Father Matthias, visits weekly to hear confessions and celebrate Mass. Between these visits, we govern ourselves through our Grand Mistress, elected by all fully admitted beguines. We study scripture together, discuss the writings of Hadewich and Mechthild, and develop our own understandings of divine love. The mendicant friars view us with suspicion. Last month, a Dominican preacher publicly questioned whether women without male governance could maintain doctrinal purity. 2 beguinages in nearby towns have been investigated for heresy. We walk a careful line, demonstrating our orthodoxy through regular confession and charitable works, while preserving the precious space of female community and spiritual exploration. Sister Agnes returned from market today with rumors of a new tax. Economic pressures grow as the wool trade struggles. Yet our community remains economically viable through careful management and the diversity of our members' skills. In a world where most women must define themselves through relationships to men, as daughters, wives, mothers, or nuns under male authority, we have created a different path. Tonight, as I spin by candlelight, I will meditate on Mechthild's vision of the flowing light of divinity. My hands remain productive while my spirit contemplates mysteries. This balance of practical work and contemplation defines our beguine life, neither rejecting the world entirely like cloistered nuns, nor being fully immersed in it like laywomen. In this in-between space, we find both service and freedom. This narrative reflects historical evidence about pagan communities, which provided alternative religious and social spaces for women, particularly in the Low Countries and German-speaking regions. The late Middle Ages saw significant religious conflicts, including the Western Schism, 1378 to 1417, when competing popes claimed authority, and early reform movements like Lollardy in England and Hussitism in Bohemia. These disruptions sometimes created openings for women's religious expression and leadership. However, increased anxiety about religious orthodoxy also led to greater scrutiny of women's spiritual practices. The Beguines faced periodic persecution, with some communities accused of heresy. Marguerite Porret, a French Beguine and mystical writer, was burned at the stake in 1310 for refusing to recant her book, The Mirror of Simple Souls. Although the most intense European witch hunts occurred after the medieval period, their foundations were laid in the 15th century. The Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of Witches, published in 1486, explicitly linked witchcraft to women, claiming they were more susceptible to demonic influence due to inherent intellectual and moral weaknesses. Early witch trials reveal the gendered nature of these accusations. Women, particularly those who were elderly, widowed, poor, or socially marginalized, faced disproportionate risk of accusation. However, witch hunting varied significantly by region, intense in some areas while virtually non-existent in others during the medieval period. The reasons for gendering witchcraft remain debated by historians. Factors include the association of women with domestic healing practices, increasingly viewed with suspicion, economic and social vulnerabilities that made certain women easy targets, and theological views about female susceptibility to temptation dating back to Eve. By the 15th century, medieval cities had developed complex social and economic structures with distinct implications for women's lives. Urban authorities increasingly regulated marriage, sexual behavior, and public morality. Cities established specialized institutions for fallen women, including convents for reformed prostitutes and homes for unmarried mothers. Prostitution itself became more regulated, with many cities establishing official brothels under municipal oversight. This reflected pragmatic acceptance of prostitution as a necessary evil that supposedly protected respectable women from male sexual aggression while allowing authorities to monitor and tax the trade. Marriage among urban commoners typically occurred later than among the nobility, with women often marrying in their early to mid-20s. This allowed young women to work and accumulate resources before establishing households. Urban marriage often represented a business partnership, as well as a personal relationship, with spouses collaboratively managing workshops or retail establishments. Female literacy increased in late medieval urban environments, particularly among merchant families who needed literate wives to assist with business correspondence and accounting. However, formal education remained primarily male-oriented, with girls typically educated at home rather than in schools. Christine de Pizan, 1364 c. 1430, Europe's first professional female author, exemplifies the possibilities and limitations of female education in this period. Born in Italy and raised at the French court, she received an unusually thorough education from her father. Widowed at 25 with 3 children to support, she turned her literacy into a profession, writing commissioned works for noble patrons. In the Book of the City of Ladies, 1405, Christine directly challenged misogynistic literary traditions, creating an allegorical city populated by virtuous and accomplished women from history. Her work demonstrates both the possibility of female intellectual achievement and the necessity of defending that possibility against prevalent assumptions of female inferiority. First-person narrative, A Merchant's Daughter in Nuremberg, circa 1490 CE. Father's latest letter from the Frankfurt Fair lies open before me as I calculate the values of different cloth shipments in our ledger. My quill moves rapidly across the page, converting weights and measures, adjusting for quality variations, noting exchange rates between different currencies. At 19, I have managed our family accounts for 3 years, since mother's death left father alone with 5 children and a substantial textile import business. My brother Hans will inherit the business eventually, but at 14, he still has much to learn. Father relies on my calculations and correspondence, though he would never admit this dependence to his guild brothers. When they visit, I retreat to the solar where women belong, only to return to the counting room once they depart. The letter from the matchmaker arrived yesterday. A prosperous widower, owner of a dye works, seeking a wife with dowry and business sense. At 38, he is older than father, but the alliance would strengthen our position in the local cloth finishing trade. Father has given me until Sunday to consider the proposal, an unusual courtesy that acknowledges my value to our household. My friend Margaret married at 16 and has already buried 2 infants. My cousin Ursula entered the Dominican convent with a smaller dowry than marriage would require. My options as a merchant's daughter are relatively privileged: marriage with some choice of husband, religious life, or remaining in my father's household to assist with his business and perhaps care for him in old age. The new printing press near the Hauptmarkt fascinates me. Last month I purchased a small devotional book, my own book, not the family Bible or a borrowed manuscript. The printer's wife showed me the type blocks, explaining how her husband creates them while she assists with inking and binding. Perhaps such a business would welcome a knowledgeable wife with capital to invest. The cathedral bells mark the hour for afternoon prayers. I close the ledger, cover my hair with a fresh linen veil, and prepare to walk with my sister to church. The streets are busy with pre-Lenten commerce, merchants hurrying to complete transactions, apprentices delivering goods, servants purchasing supplies. I greet the widow Hoffman, who manages her late husband's spice import business. Another woman navigating the narrow spaces between formal restrictions and practical necessities. Tonight, I will discuss the marriage proposal with Father, evaluating it as I would a business proposition. If I accept, I will negotiate to maintain some authority over my dowry investments. If I decline, I must present an alternative that serves our family's interests. Even in the most personal decisions, commerce and calculation shape a merchant's daughter's choices. This narrative reflects historical evidence about urban women's education, economic roles, and marriage patterns in late medieval trading cities, particularly in German-speaking regions with strong merchant communities. The late Middle Ages witnessed several notable female rulers who exercised significant political power. Blanche of Castile, 1188 to 1252, ruled France as regent for her son Louis X, successfully defending his throne against rebellious nobles and establishing herself as a capable military leader and administrator. Isabella of Castile, 1451 to 1504, ruling in her own right and through her marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon, unified Spain, sponsored Columbus's voyages, implemented religious reforms, and led military campaigns. Margaret of Denmark, 1353 to 1412, created the Kalmar Union, uniting Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under her effective rule through a combination of inheritance rights, marriage alliance, and political skill. These women ruled successfully despite theoretical prohibitions against female governance. Their examples demonstrate the gap between prescriptive literature about women's proper roles and the practical realities of dynastic politics, which sometimes required female leadership. These strategies appear consistently across different European regions, suggesting structural patterns in how women navigated political leadership in societies theoretically opposed to female rule. Despite limited access to formal training, women contributed significantly to medieval art and literature. Textile production, from everyday spinning and weaving to elaborate embroidery and tapestry, represented a major avenue for female creativity. While often dismissed as mere craft rather than art, textiles required technical skill, design sense, and cultural knowledge. The Bayeux Tapestry, depicting the Norman conquest of England, was likely designed by men, but executed by female embroiderers whose technical expertise made the narrative possible. Noble and royal women commissioned and sometimes designed tapestries for both devotional purposes and secular display. Beyond Christine de Pizan, other women wrote significant texts during the later Middle Ages. Marjorie Kempie's autobiography provides unique insights into a merchant-class woman's spiritual and physical journeys. Julian of Norwich's Revelations of Divine Love develops sophisticated theological concepts through accessible metaphors drawn from women's everyday experiences. Noble women like Marie de Champagne patronized male authors while shaping the content and values expressed in the resulting works. This indirect influence allowed women to participate in literary culture even when direct authorship remained exceptional. First-person narrative. A noble woman and patron of the arts in Burgundy, circa 1460 CE. The illuminator presents his completed work with a deep bow. The Book of Hours he has created for me represents a year of labor, each page a jewel of color and gold leaf. The calendar illustrated with the seasonal activities of common folk, the prayers accompanied by scenes from Christ's life and the Virgin's miracles. The binding will be completed next month, my lady, he explains. The leatherworker has begun tooling the cover with your family emblems. I examine the manuscript carefully, appreciating both its devotional content and its value as a display of my family's wealth and taste. Books remain precious objects, though the new printing methods slowly spreading from German lands may someday change this. For now, a commissioned manuscript signals refinement and piety, both qualities essential to a noblewoman's reputation. Since my husband's death at Agincourt 15 years ago, I have managed our estates while raising our son to adulthood. Now that he has his own household, I find greater freedom to pursue my interests in literature and art. My chambers have become a small center of culture, hosting readings of the latest romances and discussions of classical learning rediscovered through contact with Byzantine scholars. Last month I commissioned a set of tapestries depicting the 9 worthies for our great hall. The designs are complete, showing ancient heroes, biblical kings, and Christian knights as models of virtuous leadership. The weavers in Harras will begin work this spring, with completion expected in 2 years. My grandson will inherit both the tapestries and the values they represent. Tonight's entertainment features a poet from Italy introducing sonnets, a new verse form gaining popularity. I have arranged translation for those guests who speak only French. Such cultural exchanges distinguish our court and strengthen connections with Italian banking families who manage much of Europe's high finance. My daughter-in-law sometimes questions such expenditures, seeing only their cost rather than their value in establishing our family's place in Burgundy's competitive noble society. Art is never merely decorative in our world. It is political, devotional, and dynastic. Through patronage, I shape not only our family's image, but contribute to cultural evolution itself, a form of influence available to women even when more direct power remains elusive. This narrative reflects historical evidence about aristocratic women's cultural patronage, the political and social functions of art commissions, and the increased autonomy some noble women experienced as widows. As the Middle Ages transitioned into the Renaissance, women's experiences reflected both continuity and change. Renaissance humanism, with its emphasis on classical learning and individual potential, created theoretical support for female education. Treatises like Juan Luis Vives' Education of a Christian Woman, 1523, advocated literacy and learning for women, albeit primarily to make them better wives and mothers. In practice, humanist education remained predominantly available to elite women. Isabella Este, 1474-1539, Marchioness of Mantua, exemplifies the Renaissance-educated woman, fluent in Latin and Greek, knowledgeable about classical literature, and an important art patron. However, such accomplishments remained exceptional rather than normative. The Protestant Reformation, beginning in 1517, had complex implications for women. Protestant emphasis on scripture reading encouraged female literacy, and the rejection of monastic life redirected religious women toward family roles elevated in Protestant theology. However, the closure of convents eliminated important spaces for female community and authority. Protestant emphasis on wifely submission and domestic responsibilities reinforced patriarchal household structures, while the Catholic Counter-Reformation increasingly restricted female religious expression. This exploration of women's lives across 1,000 years of medieval European history reveals several key insights. Popular imagery often presents medieval women as either completely oppressed victims or exceptional individuals who transcended their time. Reality was more complex. Women operated within constraining social and legal structures, yet frequently found ways to exercise agency, influence, and occasionally direct power. The diversity of women's experiences across regions, social classes, time periods, and individual circumstances defies simple characterization. A peasant woman in 13th century Sicily lived a dramatically different life from a merchant's wife in 15th century Flanders or a nun in 9th century Saxony. Yet all navigated gender expectations that, while different from our own, were never monolithic or static. Throughout the Middle Ages, women's work, both productive and reproductive, was essential to family survival and social functioning. From agricultural labor to textile production, from child-rearing to elderly care, from food preparation to healing practices, women's work sustained communities even when undervalued in official records. Economic contributions gave women practical authority that sometimes contradicted their theoretical subordination. A skilled brewery worker, an experienced midwife, or a knowledgeable estate manager wielded real influence regardless of formal legal limitations. Medieval Christianity presented paradoxical messages about women, emphasizing their spiritual equality while restricting their formal religious authority, venerating the Virgin Mary while blaming Eve for humanity's fall, valuing female virginity while requiring most women to marry and bear children. Within these contradictions, women found both constraints and opportunities. Religious life offered education, community, and authority unavailable elsewhere. Mystical experiences provided direct access to divine authority that bypassed male ecclesiastical hierarchies. Even as the institutional church increasingly restricted women's roles, women continued to shape religious culture through patronage, education, household devotions, and sometimes direct challenges to prevailing interpretations. The medieval period witnessed profound crises: plague, famine, war, and social upheaval. Women often bore the brunt of these disasters while playing crucial roles in community survival and recovery. Their strategies for navigating catastrophe reveal remarkable resilience and adaptability. After the Black Death, women moved into economic spaces previously closed to them. During wars, women managed estates and defended communities. In times of religious conflict, women preserved traditional practices or embraced new spiritual paths. This adaptability, this persistent finding of ways to survive and occasionally thrive within changing constraints, characterizes medieval women's experiences across time and place. The experiences of medieval women are not merely historical curiosities, but part of the long story of how gender has been constructed, challenged, and renegotiated across human societies. Understanding their lives helps us recognize both the historical roots of modern gender assumptions and the contingency of those assumptions. The medieval woman, whether peasant or queen, merchant or nun, speaks to us across centuries, not as a distant other, but as a fellow human, navigating the universal challenges of survival, meaning-making, and relationship while dealing with the particular constraints and opportunities of her time and place. In her resilience, creativity, and complexity, we may find both inspiration and perspective for our own ongoing negotiations of gender and power. History is not just what was, but what could have been. When we listen to the voices of medieval women, preserved in their writings, their art, the records of their actions, and the physical spaces they inhabited, we expand our understanding not only of the past, but of human possibility itself. Isabel Montgomery, contemporary historian. As Europe transitioned from the medieval to the early modern period, the experiences, knowledge, and cultural contributions of medieval women continued to shape society in profound ways. Their legacy extended far beyond the traditional endpoint of the Middle Ages, influencing developments in politics, religion, medicine, literature, and family life well into subsequent centuries. The religious pathways carved by medieval female mystics and writers provided models and inspiration for women in the tumultuous religious landscape of the 16th and 17th centuries. Teresa of Avila, 1515–1582, though firmly situated in the early modern period, drew upon the mystical traditions established by Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, and other medieval women who claimed direct experience of the divine. During the Protestant Reformation, women found both new constraints and opportunities. The dissolution of monasteries eliminated important spaces for female community and education, yet Protestant emphasis on individual Bible reading encouraged female literacy. Some women became influential religious voices, despite formal exclusion from clerical roles. Anne Askew, 1521–1546, an English Protestant martyr, defended her religious beliefs with such theological acumen during her heresy trial that authorities tortured her, the only woman recorded as tortured in the Tower of London, before burning her at the stake. Argula von Grumbach, 1492–1554, a German noblewoman, published pamphlets defending Lutheran ideas and challenging Catholic authorities to public debate. Remarkable assertions of female theological authority built upon medieval precedents. The Catholic Counter-Reformation simultaneously restricted women's formal religious roles while elevating particular female saints and visionaries as models of Reformed piety. This pattern reflected the medieval church's paradoxical approach to female spirituality, encouraging certain forms of female religious expression while carefully containing their potential challenge to male ecclesiastical authority. The medical knowledge developed and transmitted by medieval women, particularly in midwifery, herbalism, and practical healing, faced increasing challenges in the early modern period. As university-trained male physicians sought to professionalize medicine, they often denigrated traditional female healers as ignorant at best and dangerous at worst. The witch hunts that intensified in the 16th and 17th centuries, far beyond their medieval origins, often targeted women with healing knowledge. The wise woman, respected in medieval village life, became increasingly vulnerable to accusations of malefic magic as competition for medical authority intensified. Yet women's medical knowledge proved resilient. Louise Bourgeois, 1563–1636, midwife to the French royal family, published influential obstetrical treatises that combined traditional female birthing knowledge with newer anatomical understanding. Her work formed a bridge between medieval female healing traditions and modern obstetrics. Jane Sharp's The Midwives' Book, 1671, similarly presented traditional midwifery knowledge in systematic form, preserving and legitimizing practices developed over centuries of female experience. These early modern medical women, drew upon the accumulated wisdom of countless unnamed medieval predecessors whose practical knowledge had sustained communities through plague, famine, and war. The strategies developed by medieval female rulers provided models for the remarkable concentration of female monarchs in 16th century Europe. Elizabeth I of England, 1533 to 1603. Mary Queen of Scots, 1542 to 1587. Catherine de' Medici of France, 1590 to 1589, and Mary of Hungary, 1505 to 1558. All navigated the fundamental contradiction between their female gender and sovereign authority. Like their medieval predecessors, these early modern queens emphasized their exceptional status, cultivated relationships with religious authorities, managed complex marriage politics, and developed symbolic representations that reconciled female bodies with sovereign power. The portraits of Elizabeth I as both Virgin Queen and Imperial ruler built upon medieval Marian imagery while adapting it to Protestant sensibilities. Mary Tudor's 1560-1558 unsuccessful attempt to restore Catholicism in England, and Catherine de' Medici's pragmatic religious policies during the French Wars of Religion reflected the continuing challenges of female rule in societies theoretically opposed to women's political authority. Challenges that Blanche of Castile, Isabella of Castile, and other medieval queens had confronted earlier. The economic roles medieval women performed, managing households, participating in agricultural production, brewing ale, producing textiles, selling goods in markets, evolved as economic structures changed. The transition to early capitalism brought both restrictions and new opportunities. As brewing shifted from household production, predominantly by women, to commercial enterprise, women were increasingly excluded from this industry. Similar patterns occurred in textile production as it moved from domestic to workshop settings. The guilds that had sometimes accommodated women in the late medieval period increasingly excluded them in the 16th and 17th centuries. Yet entrepreneurial women found niches in the expanding commercial economy. Female merchants continued traditions established by medieval predecessors. Glover Eliza Pinckney, 1722 to 1793, who introduced indigo cultivation to South Carolina, represented the kind of agricultural innovation and management that medieval estate-managing women had practiced in different contexts. The deputy husband concept, whereby a wife could legally act on her husband's behalf in business, emerged from medieval precedents, where wives had managed enterprises during husbands' absences. This legal concept provided important flexibility within the constraints of coverture, the legal principle that a married woman's legal rights were covered by her husband. The humanist education available to some elite women in the Renaissance built upon medieval foundations. The learned abbesses of early medieval convents, the literary patronesses of the High Middle Ages, and late medieval authors like Christine de Pizan had established that women could participate in intellectual culture despite formal exclusion from universities. Christine de Pizan's defense of women's intellectual capabilities in The Book of the City of Ladies found echoes in later works like Marie de Gournay's The Equality of Men and Women, 1622. The Querelle des Femmes, debate about women, that occupied European intellectuals well into the 18th century, built upon arguments first formulated in medieval contexts. When Laura Serreta, 1469 to 1499, defended women's intellectual equality in her letters, she participated in a tradition of female scholarship with medieval roots. When Margaret Cavendish, 1623 to 1673, published works on natural philosophy, she extended patterns of female intellectual engagement that reached back to Hildegard of Bingden's scientific writings. For ordinary women, The transition from medieval to early modern brought both change and continuity. Agricultural rhythms, childbearing patterns, domestic responsibilities, and community roles evolved gradually, rather than abruptly, at the arbitrary boundary of 1500. A rural woman in 16th century France would recognize much in her medieval grandmother's experience. The seasonal agricultural work, the integration of productive and reproductive labor, the centrality of family and community relationships. Yet she might also experience new religious tensions, changing economic pressures, and evolving legal structures that reflected broader societal transformations. The household remained the primary economic unit, with women's labor essential to its functioning. The skills medieval mothers had taught daughters, cooking, textile production, childcare, basic medical care, remained valuable even as their specific applications evolved with new technologies and materials. The material culture created by medieval women continued to shape daily life well into the early modern period and beyond. Textiles women had woven or embroidered became family heirlooms, carrying both practical utility and cultural memory. Recipes passed from mother to daughter preserved culinary traditions and medical knowledge across generations. Religious objects commissioned by medieval noblewomen remained in use in churches and cathedrals. Buildings founded through female patronage continued to serve communities. The manuscript books owned, commissioned, or created by medieval women became part of early modern libraries. These material objects represented tangible connections between generations of women, links in a chain of female experience and creation that transcended the arbitrary periodization imposed by later historians. As we move further from the medieval period, the experiences of medieval women might seem increasingly distant from our own. Yet certain continuities persist that make their lives relevant to contemporary understanding. The tension between prescribed gender roles and lived reality. Medieval women, like women throughout history, navigated between societal expectations and practical necessities, finding agency within constraints. The complex relationship between religious beliefs and women's lives, providing both restrictions and opportunities, both justifications for subordination and resources for resistance. The essential, yet often undervalued nature of women's work. Productive and reproductive labor that sustained families and communities while receiving less recognition than male-dominated activities. The importance of female networks and communities, whether formal, like convents, or informal, like village women gathering at wells, providing support, knowledge transmission, and collective strength. These patterns, first documented in our medieval sources, continued to characterize women's experiences through the early modern period and beyond. The arbitrary boundary of 1500 CE, while useful for organizing historical narrative, masks these essential continuities in women's lived experiences. Our understanding of medieval women continues to evolve as historians develop new methodologies and perspectives. Archaeological discoveries, reinterpretation of legal and ecclesiastical records, analysis of material culture, and interdisciplinary approaches all contribute to a richer, more nuanced picture of women's medieval experiences. The recovery of medieval women's voices, literal voices in their written works, metaphorical voices in their actions, creations, and choices, remains an ongoing project. Each generation asks new questions of the evidence, seeing aspects of medieval women's lives that previous scholars overlooked or misinterpreted. This continuing scholarly conversation keeps medieval women's experiences relevant, allowing their stories to inform our understanding of gender, power, resistance, and agency across time. Their voices, once relegated to the margins of historical narrative, increasingly move toward the center, enriching our understanding not only of the medieval past, but of the human experience across time. As Marie de France wrote in the prologue to her Lace in the 12th century, "Whoever has received knowledge and eloquence and speech from God should not be silent or conceal it, but demonstrate it willingly." 8 centuries later, we continue to benefit from the knowledge and eloquence of medieval women who refuse to be silent, whose voices reach us across time, and whose experiences expand our understanding of the rich tapestry of human history. As our journey through a millennium of women's medieval experiences draws to a close, we must consider not only what these women's lives meant in their own time, but how their stories continue to resonate in our collective historical consciousness. The medieval woman, in all her diversity across time, region, and social station, occupies a complex place in both scholarly understanding and popular imagination. The study of medieval women has undergone profound transformation since the mid-20th century. Early medieval historiography often relegated women to footnotes or specialized chapters on women's history, treating their experiences as peripheral to the central narrative of political, military, and institutional developments. The pioneering work of historians like Eileen Power, whose Medieval Women, published posthumously in 1975, brought women's experiences into mainstream historical discussion, opened new pathways for understanding the medieval period. Subsequent scholars including Caroline Walker Bynum, Judith Bennett, Joan Kelly, and many others further transformed the field by asking not just, what did women do? But how does centering women's experiences change our understanding of the Middle Ages as a whole? This shift in perspective revealed that when we place women at the center, rather than the margins of historical inquiry, our entire understanding of medieval society transforms. Power relationships appear more complex, the boundaries between public and private spheres more permeable, and the dynamics of historical change more nuanced. The integration of gender analysis with other categories of historical difference, including social class, religious identity, regional culture, and life cycle stage, has created an increasingly sophisticated picture of medieval women's diverse experiences. No longer can we speak of the medieval woman as a monolithic category. Instead, we recognize the enormous variations in female experience across the medieval millennium. Popular understanding of medieval women has often swung between two extremes, portraying the Middle Ages either as an unrelieved nightmare of female oppression or romanticizing it as a lost golden age of female power and influence. Both narratives distort the complex reality of medieval women's lives. The oppression narrative correctly identifies the patriarchal structures that constrained women's choices, but often fails to recognize the agency women exercised within these constraints. It neglects evidence of women's economic contributions, intellectual achievements, spiritual authority, and political influence. This perspective sometimes imposes modern expectations on medieval contexts, judging the past by contemporary standards rather than understanding it on its own terms. Conversely, the romanticized view selectively emphasizes exceptional women or isolated cultural practices that granted women certain rights, while minimizing the very real limitations most women faced. This perspective sometimes projects modern desires for female empowerment backward onto historical periods where gender conceptualization differed fundamentally from our own. A more nuanced understanding recognizes both the structural constraints medieval women faced and the remarkable ways they navigated, negotiated, and sometimes subverted these constraints. It acknowledges that opportunities and limitations vary dramatically by social class, region, time period, and individual circumstance. Most importantly, It recognizes medieval women as full historical actors making meaningful choices within their particular contexts, neither passive victims nor anachronistically liberated figures. Traditional historical narratives often present women's history as a linear progression from medieval oppression toward modern liberation. This teleological approach distorts understanding of both periods. Medieval women sometimes had rights and opportunities that were lost in early modern periods. Guild restrictions on female labor often tightened rather than loosened in the 16th and 17th centuries. The scientific revolution frequently devalued traditionally female healing knowledge in favor of male-dominated theoretical medicine. Protestant rejection of female monasticism eliminated important spaces for women's education and authority. Conversely, aspects of medieval gender ideology continued to limit women's opportunities well into the modern period. The notion that women's primary purpose was reproduction, that their place was primarily domestic, and that their nature was more emotional than rational, all concepts with medieval theological underpinnings, influenced gender expectations well into the 20th century and beyond. Rather than a story of straightforward progress, women's history reveals complex patterns of advance and retreat, opportunity and restriction that defy simple linear narratives. The medieval period itself saw both expansions and contractions of women's opportunities, influenced by religious developments, economic changes, demographic shifts, and cultural evolutions. Perhaps the greatest challenge in understanding medieval women's lives remains the nature of our sources. The vast majority of medieval texts were written by men, often elite men with particular religious or political perspectives. Women's voices reach us filtered through male interpretation, colored by male assumptions, and selected according to male priorities. Even when women speak directly through their own writings, as with Hildegard of Bingen, Marie de France, Julian of Norwich, Christine de Pizan, and others, these authors represent exceptional cases rather than typical experiences. The voices of ordinary women, peasants, artisans, servants, mothers, reach us primarily through court records, often in moments of crisis or conflict that may not represent their typical experiences. Archaeological evidence offers different insights. The material culture women created and used, the physical environments they inhabited, the remains that tell stories of their diets, health, work, and deaths. This evidence speaks differently than texts, offering concrete particulars rather than abstract generalizations, tangible remnants rather than ideological constructs. The integration of textual and material evidence, combined with careful methodological awareness of the biases and limitations in our sources, allows for increasingly nuanced recovery of medieval women's experiences. While we can never hear directly from the vast majority of medieval women, we can create evidence-based interpretations that respect their humanity, agency, and historical significance. Medieval women remain present in our cultural imagination, though often in highly distorted forms. Popular media frequently portray medieval women as either helpless damsels awaiting rescue or anachronistically strong female characters with thoroughly modern sensibilities. Both portrayals fail to engage with the complex reality of medieval gender constructions. More thoughtful fictional treatments, like Sigrid Undset's Kristin Lavransdatter trilogy, or Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, attempt to represent medieval women's experiences with greater historical sensitivity, recognizing both the constraints they faced and the agency they exercised within those constraints. Beyond fiction, medieval women's experiences continue to inform contemporary discussions of gender, power, and social organization. Feminist scholars draw inspiration from female mystical traditions that validated women's spiritual experiences against institutional skepticism. Religious communities look to medieval female saints and leaders as models of faith and service. Political theorists examine how exceptional women navigated leadership in societies theoretically opposed to female authority. When protesters against restrictive reproductive legislation dress as handmaids from Margaret Atwood's dystopian novel, they evoke fears of returning to imagined medieval restrictions, often without recognizing the complexities of actual medieval women's control over reproduction. When contemporary women reclaim traditional crafts like weaving, brewing, or herbalism, they sometimes consciously connect to medieval female traditions of productive labor and practical knowledge. These contemporary invocations of medieval womanhood, whether historically informed or based on problematic stereotypes, demonstrate the continued relevance of medieval women's experiences to modern concerns. The medieval past remains alive in our cultural consciousness, influencing how we understand gender, power, religion, and social organization in the present. Throughout this exploration, we have moved between the collective patterns of women's experiences and individual life stories, some documented in historical sources, others reconstructed as plausible narratives based on available evidence. This movement between the general and the particular reflects the fundamental tension in all historical understanding. Statistical patterns and structural analyses tell us what was typical, common, or expected. They reveal the broad contours of opportunity and constraint within which medieval women operated. But these generalizations always risk flattening the rich texture of individual lives, the particularity of personal choices, the uniqueness of individual responses to common circumstances. Conversely, individual stories, whether from surviving autobiographical accounts like Marjorie Kempy's book, or constructed narratives based on typical experiences, provide emotional connection and human dimension to our understanding. But these specific cases may not represent broader patterns, may be exceptional rather than typical, may mislead us about the common experience if generalized too broadly. The most complete understanding emerges from the creative tension between these approaches, using structural analysis to contextualize individual stories, while allowing those stories to complicate and nuance our structural understanding. The medieval woman exists for us in this interplay between the documented individual and the analytically constructed collective. Our exploration has taken us across a vast terrain, temporally, geographically, and conceptually. We have witnessed the transformation of late antique gender patterns into early medieval forms, the development of feudal and manorial systems with their distinctive gender implications, the growth of towns and commercial economies, creating new opportunities and restrictions for women, and the crises of the late Middle Ages that sometimes disrupted traditional gender arrangements. We have journeyed from rural peasant cottages to royal courts, from urban workshops to cloistered convents, from battlefield encampments to university debates. We have encountered women as agricultural laborers and queens, as mystics and merchants, as healers and accused witches, as artists and scholars. Throughout this journey, we have sought to understand medieval women on their own terms, recognizing the vast differences between their worldviews and our own, while acknowledging the common humanity that connects us across the centuries. We have tried to avoid both the condescension of dismissing medieval gender arrangements as simply oppressive and the romanticism of projecting modern values onto medieval contexts. This exploration is not definitive or complete. No single account could encompass the full diversity of women's medieval experiences. Rather, it represents one contribution to an ongoing conversation about how we understand, interpret, and learn from the lives of women who came before us. As we continue this conversation, as scholars, students, and all who seek to understand the human past, we honor the medieval women whose lives we study. By taking their experiences seriously, by recognizing their agency within constraint, by listening carefully to their voices when they reach us, and thoughtfully reconstructing their likely perspectives when direct testimony is lacking, we affirm their full humanity and historical significance. The medieval woman, in all her diversity across time, place, and circumstance, deserves neither our pity nor our romanticization, but rather our respectful attention. Her experiences, both typical and exceptional, form an essential part of our collective human story. By recovering her history in all its complexity, we enrich our understanding not only of the medieval past, but of the human experience across time. Let us conclude with the words of Christine de Pizan, whose defense of women's capabilities in The Book of the City of Ladies, 1405, reminds us that medieval women themselves were conscious of their historical significance and concerned with how they would be remembered. All ladies, queens, princesses, and women of every social category, light up your understanding, direct your gaze into the clear mirror of your consciousness, and see if what misogynist writers say is true. Do not allow yourselves to be disparaged in this way by those who are jealous of you, no matter how many books may say such things against us. For the more the matter is debated and pursued, the clearer your innocence and the falseness of the lies against you will appear, and the greater will be the reputation of women in times to come. After more than 6 centuries, Christine's hope for greater understanding of women's true capabilities and contributions continues to be realized through our ongoing efforts to recover, interpret, and honor the diverse experiences of medieval women across Europe and beyond.